For more than a year, India has debated on how to implement a technology that is expected to change the face of telecommunications in the country. But there seems to be a way forward now. The government is looking to relax entry barriers for the very lucrative satellite communications or satcom technology. Security requirements to get a satcom license may soon be eased. Among other things, this would also mean the entry of global behemoths such as Elon Musk's Starlink and Jeff Bezos' Kuiper into the market. But the news has also set off alarm bells among India's perennially insecure telecom companies like Reliance Jio, Bharti Airtel, and Vodafone Idea. All of these players have been up in arms over the government's proposed move to have satcom companies acquire spectrum through administrative allocation subject to a fee rather than through auctions akin to their process. A fierce battle is already underway, pitching these global satellite firms against India's top telcos over the allocation mode of satellite spectrum as well as its pricing to support broadband from space services. Why? Because India's top telcos are seeking equal treatment of telecom and satcom services. They have urged the telecom regulator to permit only auction satellite spectrum for servicing urban or retail consumers, saying that Starlink, Amazon, and others have a clear plan to offer satellite broadband services in urban areas and eventually will compete with them directly. More so since telcos have spent billions of dollars in buying spectrum for terrestrial networks. The satellite firms, though, have rejected the telcos' calls for auctioning satellite spectrum, contending that since satcom airways are a shared resource, they cannot be auctioned. At stake is India's space economy, which is projected to expand to $44 billion by 2033, capturing 8% of the global market from its current 2%. But what is the significance of SATCOM? Will the entry of global players like Starlink and Kuiper revolutionize the data market in India? Should telecom providers be worried? Will pricing be a problem for SATCOM players in India? What are the security concerns with SATCOM? How have Starlink and Kuiper navigated regulatory hurdles in other countries that they operate in? What is the status of indigenous players in the SATCOM space? Stay tuned as we bring you the answers to all of this and more from two ace analysts. It's Thursday, December 12th. I'm your host, Diya Rekhi, and you are listening to SATCOM Wars only on the Morning Brief from the Economic Times. To begin with, let's delve deeper into what is happening in the Indian context and what the government's relaxation of norms really means for Indian internet users. Listen in as we speak to Siddhant of Counterpoint Research. Siddhant, let me start with the most basic question. Why do we need satellite communication in the first place?
It's a very pertinent question, and I'm glad that you asked it at this point, because right now we are sort of in a communication revolution, if I must. When I mean communication revolution, I mean that we're trying to connect almost everything. The fact that SATCOM has an integral role to play, it's from the fact that you need to provide quality broadband services to everybody, because the the content consumption and creation is rising from almost everywhere. And we've seen that there are 4 different sets of consumers that are set to benefit from this. You have the residential people, then you have people who go on trekking and roaming and who just take their cars and, go for a spin-off here and there in the hills. You have mission critical cases, you have teams and projects that are running in the remotest parts of the countries. And then you have something which I call ports and boats, these essential places where maybe the fiber cannot go, maybe 5G or 4G does not meet the technological requirements of mobility. So that's why I think slowly and steadily the impact of satellite is growing, because we've been able to harness the right technology almost at the right time. Now with the LEO satellites that have come in, and as a matter of fact, now the D2D has also come in, where direct to device communications have been, an active part of our network infrastructure. So one of these sectors, education, healthcare, agriculture, tourism. So these sectors have a lot to offer, especially when you go to the remotest parts of areas and you see that, the data consumption is on the rise. The data migration is on the rise and the digital literacy on the rise. So when you have a technology right at the right time, at the right place, that can just alter how these people communicate with each other and the rest of the nation, I think that's the time when we can take a step ahead into the future.
Before we move ahead though, let's address a basic question. Why is Starlink such a big deal? Apart from being helmed by arguably one of the most influential men of our times, Starlink has rapidly scaled since its beta launch in October 2020 to grow from 1 million subscribers in December 2022 to 4 million now. The service operates through a vast constellation of nearly 6,000 satellites, providing satellite internet to users in almost 100 countries, including its expanding presence in previously underserved regions like Africa and the Pacific Islands. Let's be clear though, Starlink is not the only player in this space, but is probably the largest. However, rivals are beginning to close the gap. Amazon's Project Kuiper plans to launch a constellation of 3,232 satellites, with half expected to be operational by 2026. Though commercial service from Kuiper isn't anticipated until 2025, the project represents a formidable future competitor for Starlink. Then there's also OneWeb, which merged with Eutelsat and has its own constellation of 634 satellites and caters primarily to business customers. Now, OneWeb's business model contrasts that of Starlink, which focuses on residential users. But despite this, let me say that Starlink remains the clear leader in the field. Because Starlink operates satellites in low Earth orbits at 550 kilometers compared to, say, OneWeb's 1,200 kilometers, Starlink is able to offer lower latency, which is what makes it attractive to users who are seeking faster internet speeds in remote areas. And now with Donald Trump coming in and Musk's increased prominence, it could mean an acceleration of Starlink's plans in India. Now we know that the government has relaxed some entry barriers into the satcom space in India, but Siddhant said it needs to do more. Here's what he had to say.
So, as a matter of fact, when we talk about entry into this new market, the satellite market as a whole, so what we believe that the government and the regulatory bodies are trying to do right now, they're not trying to lower the barrier of entry. They're trying to normalize it to bring in the global leaders. And in that, I think the biggest reform, or I think the biggest step that they're trying to do is firstly starting with allocating the spectrum by administering it, not going the auction way. And besides that, then we have two very different set yet long, stringent list of regulations. So I think in the short run, some temporary relaxations can be done with respect to, how quickly the policy approval goes through with respect to satellites, with respect to different government regulatory bodies, especially when it comes to people, companies like Starlink or Kuiper. There can also be regulations in terms of how they set up their initial tariffs to get the ball rolling. And thinking out loud, maybe the payment plans, how you're going to pay the government. They can be partial payments, phased payments, just to make sure that the initial momentum keeps on going in the right direction. There could even be some easing of the FDI norms, if I may. And then there are other sets of regulation, the ones pertaining to security, where I do not believe that, our government will budge too much. There'll be a lot of relaxations. I believe there'll be low to no relaxations in that front, because that's one thing that is actually a top priority for our government for at least a couple of years now.
Sure. But Siddhant, I also wanted to understand that when it comes to telecom providers, they've been up in arms about this whole debate on whether spectrum should be auctioned rather than allocated administratively for satcom. But do you think that telecom providers are making a fair point?
So spectrum, we call it the bloodline of the RF communication. Spectrum for us is both sacred and scarce in some technical terms. There'll always be two sets of parties that are locking horns when it comes to spectrum. Always. You see, when the 5G spectrum happened, the spectrum auction happened, it was government versus the service providers who were saying that the reserve price is very high. And the government was saying, with the monetization opportunity you have, the reserve price is just fine. We have done our calculations. So there'll always be two sets of parties with differing opinion. This case, it's the CSPs or the communication service providers, Bharti Jio, versus the satcom players. Now, what essentially is happening here is satcom players are saying that the global best practices suggest spectrum must be allocated administratively. That's the best practice. It is under consideration with ITU. It's a shared resource. It's not a part of your geographical boundaries on land. It transcends that. While on the other hand, and a fair point to the communication service providers is that they're saying that, what is going to happen? My target audience is in the urban areas, who are using my 5G, who are using my fixed wired broadband. Now, if Starlink comes and Starlink starts giving same broadband services to the same sets of consumers in the urban areas, it's a clash of two different sets of industries who are focusing on the same consumer segment. Now, what happens is that Starlink has not enrolled in any spectrum purchasing process. It has not gone in ahead and gotten a license for, let's say, air coast broadband services, which Jio and Airtel have spent lakhs of crore rupees acquiring. So there will always be a point of difference between two parties. And I think if our government has gone ahead and they have said that we're going to allocate it to people administratively, it's a good move, because in that respect, we are not showing to the globe that we are a closed economy. We do not want to show that, especially in a field where global leaders like Starlink or Kuiper are trying to enter our ecosystem.
The other aspect that you mentioned early on was the security aspect. And that seems to be a recurring topic of concern, right? So what exactly are these security concerns with, say, a Starlink or Kuiper?
So our government wants that the data that is created by the Indian consumer stays within India. Second would be lawful interceptions. Now, lawful interceptions essentially mean that any eligible government entity can go ahead and access the communication network, the communication channels in case of an emergency situation. Then you have KYC. And KYC is of prime essence. If you have read very recently a news where some illegal activities were going on from Myanmar, the people were coming to India using a Starlink equipment, and there was a bust, and the total value was more than $4 billion. And now the Indian authorities want Starlink to help them trace the perpetrators. That's important. You need to know who is accessing technology, because it's such an integral part of our society now. And then lastly, it will be the buffer zones. We cannot allow communications of that level to be in areas that are having some sort of political turmoil, or maybe they are too close to our neighbors. So that's why I think security concerns are of the prime essence, and they will be the first things that will be needed to be checked off when it comes to complying with the regulations in India.
Final thought from your end, Siddhant. Should telecom providers be worried?
I don't think so. There's a reason for them to worry about, because we are such a big market. I mean, everybody can have a fair share, or a piece of cake and be happy with it. But if you talk about the fact that if there is an impact on the Indian mobile network operators, then I'd say yes. They're already feeling some heat. In the shorter run, they might be against some big players in this run. And but again, I believe that if consumers are benefiting, if the consumers are winning, then the technology has justified itself.
As we mentioned earlier, both Starlink and Amazon Kuiper's applications for GMPCS licenses, or for global mobile personal communication by satellite licenses in India, are pending, as both firms have yet to fulfill all the security prerequisites. Starlink, on its part, has communicated to the government that satcom regulations should be consistent with global standards given the worldwide nature of the services. But recently, Telecom Minister Jyotiraditya Scindia reiterated that Starlink was in the process of securing necessary approvals but must fully comply with existing regulations before any license is issued. Now, it wouldn't be wrong to say the satcom space is truly heating up and everyone wants a piece of the satcom pie. SpaceX CEO Elon Musk has said that Starlink is expected to generate $6.6 billion in revenue this year, up from $1.4 billion just 2 years ago. This revenue, by the way, is crucial for financing the development of Starship, a key piece of SpaceX's long-term space exploration plans. But will the likes of Starlink and Kuiper be able to make a dent in the Indian market? Ashutosh of Forrester doesn't seem to think so. He believes that India is not ready for satellite internet to take off immediately for a plethora of reasons. Listen to him as he breaks down his reasoning while giving us an overview of the satcom market across the globe and in India.
Now, regarding the prediction that we made, what we said that satellite internet would be dead on arrival in 2025, It wasn't specific to Starlink or any other provider. So Starlink could still launch, and they will obviously try to gain the market. But the overall satcom market has a lot of competition in the form of terrestrial broadband. So it will be very difficult for them to take the market share away from the existing broadband internet.
Ashutosh, you mentioned how Starlink took quite a while to establish itself in Kenya, right? Do you feel that it may face a similar trajectory and journey in India?
So there were a couple of reasons why we selected Starlink's experience out of Kenya, because if you look at the overall pricing from the satcom internet perspective, Starlink is obviously more common in the retail markets, whereas some other providers such as OneWeb, they also provide retail market, but they are more focused toward marine transportation. So Starlink's launch in Kenya was very similar to what it's going to be perceived in India as well from the retail perspective. And also there are a couple of similarities that Kenya has with India in terms of purchasing power parity, in terms of terrestrial internet, and with the only major difference being that in Kenya, the average price per gigabyte of internet is around 59 cents or something, whereas in India, it's only 17 cents.
Do you think satellite internet services like Starlink and Kuiper have the potential to gain traction in India in the future? Or do you feel like they're better suited for Western markets?
The way the satellite internet technology stands today in terms of its effectiveness, in terms of its pricing, there is some more maturity it needs to achieve before it becomes very comparable with what we carry in our phone in terms of mobile plans and the cellular plans that India offers. So from that perspective, at least for foreseeable future, say next 2-3 years, we are not going to see a successful satellite internet adoption in India. When I say successful, think of it this way. India has close to 700-800 million odd customers for the mobile internet, whereas something like Starlink currently in the US also is targeting a very niche sort of segment, which is either very remote, doesn't have other viable internet options, or have very specific use cases such as marine transportation, leisure, boating, or even aviation and things like that. India doesn't have very similar requirements to that of, say, North America or Canada, which are very vast regions with a lot of white spaces in terms of coverage gaps. So even our rural communities, they have fairly decent mobile coverage. And on the other hand, price affordability of that segment is, of course, not as high as that of, say, developed markets. So that takes away a significant market in terms of adoption in those rural areas. So you're left with primarily aviation and marine transportation, which is sort of corporate industry, not retail.
Given the pricing challenges that you've mentioned, why is it that companies like Starlink and Amazon's Kuiper are so keen to enter the Indian market? I mean, I understand that we have huge numbers, the market potential is great, but do we really have the pricing power that they're hoping to tap?
It's not just the pricing, but the coverage gaps, which, say, other markets provide, they just don't exist in India. It's a major reason why it won't take off as much as, say, it hasn't taken off that much in the US as well, right? Kuiper and OneWeb and Musk and everyone all are looking to expand into other geographies because they need to launch certain number of satellites in the sky to effectively provide the coverage. And most of that bandwidth is getting unused. So we have markets that they can grow into to utilize that bandwidth and milk that, I think, is the reason why they would still try to grow into as many places. It's certainly because it's a sunk investment. What they need to do is simply asset to get more customers and leverage it more. And maybe at some point, having the brand presence as some of the other sectors take off, it will also help them stay in that market and grow that market.
Another aspect that I wanted to get your thoughts on, Ashutosh, is the long-term disruption potential that you see for Satcom in India. I mean, do you see use cases for satellite communication commercially for retail customers in the next 5 to 10 years? Or do you think it's unlikely to take off?
Certainly, yes, without doubt, because obviously when it comes to technologies, ease of use compared to, say, terrestrial broadband, assuming everything else remains the same in terms of pricing, in terms of cell phone compatibility, in terms of coverage, etc., it is obviously significantly better And of course, quality of service, because this is obviously much more widespread, much more commonly available, not prone to certain types of disruptions. So it obviously has a use case, but I am not seeing, at least in 5 years or 10 years, terrestrial broadband to go away. Maybe in the long run, as this technology becomes even more involved, there are some other providers working on this space who are trying to bring this satellite launch to ultra low Earth orbit, which will improve the latency performance by reducing the latency. Then it'll become even more comparable from quality of service perspective.
Ashutosh, we are also seeing sovereign AI clouds. We're seeing governments stepping in because of security concerns, with large foreign firms holding vast amounts of citizen data, right? Do you think the dominance of American companies in controlling such critical data raises valid concerns that governments should address?
So when it comes to sovereignty and security concern, I think government has to look into it closely, because this is, like you rightly said, unlike any other area, this involves citizens' information where they are calling each other, and their own identity, their usage patterns, and you do not want some of that information to go out of the country. So as government relaxes some of these security concerns, but at the same time brings up some of the regulation to make sure whoever launches this service also provides them enough control, because we live in an environment where the security is paramount. So my assumption is government is already aware of these requirements, and they will bring in the right regulation, and as they change some of the security regulations to whether it's Starlinks or Kuiper or whoever else is running the network, will comply with those and work in collaboration to the government's objectives are met.
The government is anticipated to convene soon with companies that have applied for or received the GMPCS licenses, such as Bharti-backed Eutelsat OneWeb and Reliance Jio's joint venture with SES. But all eyes are now on the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, or TRAI, which is expected to bring out its recommendations soon on satellite spectrum. This is likely to involve details including the methodology of allocation, the pricing of spectrum, and the terms and conditions to be met by satellite operators with regard to national security, basically determining India's satellite communication policy. As these companies wait for TRAI's recommendations with bated breath, we'll make sure to stay on top of all the latest developments, so don't forget to keep listening. Whether or not telecom providers are worried, you and I as customers should rest assured that more players coming into the market is never a bad thing, because ultimately, who doesn't want faster, better internet? Thank you, Siddhant and Ashutosh. It's Thursday, December 12th. I'm your host, Diya Rekhi, and you were listening to Satcom Wars, only on the Morning Brief from the Economic Times. This episode was produced by Surohini Jain, sound designed by Indraneel Bhattacharjee, executive producers Anirban Chaudhary and Arijit Burman. Do share and subscribe if you liked the episode. The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday on a listening platform of your choice. Thank you for listening.